Good afternoon. My name is Robin Naughton, and I am the Vice President of the MHL Medical Heritage Library. I am also an Assistant Professor and Web and Digital Services Librarian at Queen's College Library in CUNY. On behalf of the MHL and its Board of Directors, I would like to welcome you to the fourth and final talk in our inaugural Spring Speaker Series. For those unfamiliar with the Medical Heritage Library, we are a collaborative digitization and discovery organization committed to providing open access to the history of medicine and the health resources. Beginning in 2009, the MHL has aspired to be a research-driven history of medicine and health community that serves a broad interdisciplinary constituency. Today's event, like all those in the speaker series, illustrates the rich ways the MHL corpus supports research. Before I introduce Elizabeth, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. Second, if you have questions for the speaker, please enter them in the chat and I'll present them as part of the Q&A. Third, we'd like to extend special thanks to the Harvard Medical School for co-hosting this event. Now, I am very pleased to welcome Elizabeth McNeil, PhD candidate in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan. Her dissertation, Speaking of Animals in the Life Sciences and Literature of 20th Century Germany, tracks the various knowledge practice at work in the constellation of animality, language, and experimentation from the mid-19th to the late 20th century in the German-speaking world. Speaking of Animals ultimately reorients well-known scientific and literary figures such as Franz Kafka, William Wundt, Robert Musil, and Konrad Lorenz in the context of once popular but today mostly forgotten or disqualified scientific discourses about animal intelligence and communication. Her talk today is titled The Animal Soul Between Peter Schnitzling and Charles Darwin. Elizabeth, I will hand it over to you now to begin your talk.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And a special thanks to everyone at the Medical Heritage Library for their organizational work, as well as to the other speakers for their fascinating talks. It's been a great spring speaker series, and I'm delighted to be part of it. Now I will share the screen and we will get started. At the beginning of 2020, the director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, Christoph Busch, wrote a review in American Scientist on a new book by the primatologist Frans de Waal. The subject of that book was animal emotions. To sum up the book's premise, de Waal does not define emotions as singularly human, nor as something that can be studied only by psychologists. Rather, de Waal understands emotions as bodily and mental states that drive behavior. And this manifestation of mental states and conscious or unconscious facial expressions, gestures, and vocal timbre, for instance, can allow scientists to study what links our inner lives to our fellow animals' inner lives. In his review, Busch praises de Waal for his empathy in particular, and notes that, quote, empathy is too often missing from the work with animals done by experimental and comparative psychologists, end quote. But empathy, suggests Busch, is de Waal's greatest strength and weakness. While de Waal has spent almost his entire career forming relationships with animals in captivity, Busch calls the study of captive animals outdated, as animals in the wild are likely to inhabit a richer environment and thus have more developed cognitive abilities. And while de Waal's anecdotes of animal behavior make for lively reading, they do not indicate how representative that behavior is. Busch ends his review encouraging young students of animal behavior to take seriously and to test de Waal's proposal that animals have emotions like shame and guilt. But he ultimately ends by wondering, quote, how one might go about eliciting behavior in a way that is both empathetic and rigorous, end quote. So those of you who have read Darwin's 1872, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, are likely shaking your heads right now. This isn't new. Indeed, de Waal's 2019 book on animal emotions is essentially an updated version of Darwin's own. Not to mention that the scientific community's reactions to de Waal's book, if they deign to react at all, are an updated version of the same kinds of resistance Darwin encountered in his day. And especially when you consider that Darwin saw expression as the follow-up to his 1871, The Descent of Man, it's actually really remarkable that that the book effectively disappeared from the scientific landscape for a century. So my talk today takes the following premise as its point of departure: that animal behavior has been a thorn in the side of the natural sciences since the foundation of the scientific study of animal behavior. And this is commonly traced back to Darwin's research on the expression of emotions in humans and animals. So the operative terms have changed, the methodological frameworks have changed, even the objects of study have changed, but the anxieties have stayed the same. Namely, the use and presentation of evidence, the danger of anthropomorphism, the most appropriate sites of study, and what methodologically constitutes a scientific, or as Bush would have it, rigorous study of animal behavior. But why exactly has animal behavior vis-a-vis emotional expression been so contentious for so long? What are the stakes of interpreting animal behavior, not as mechanical responses to stimuli, but as manifestations of mental states? I couch my answers to these questions within the rise of animal psychology as an object and a method of study in the German-speaking world, where I argue animal psychology was founded and hotly contested. I present three early formulations of a scientific study of animal behavior, with the formulation of the 19th century's most famous psychologist as the moment in which the other two collide, and complicatedly so. To be clear, I'm not talking today about comparative psychology and Carl Gustav Karus, but I'm talking about animal psychology, in German, Tierseelenkunde, and more recently, Tierpsychologie. And this has received little scholarly attention for its metaphysical and therefore disqualified framing of animal behavior. So in this talk and in my project as a whole, I'm interested in how disqualified forms of knowledge production have actually influenced so-called legitimate forms of knowledge production. So in this talk, I construct an original narrative of a particular line of thinking one's way into animal behavior. These three formulations take us from the 1830s to the 1880s, that is, from the last breaths of natural philosophy to the reign of the natural sciences. Beginning with Darwin's behavioral experiments in the London Zoological Gardens, I then turn to the Swiss priest, philosopher, and professor of natural history, Peter Scheitlin, and his 1840 Science of the Animal Soul. And I actually maintain that Scheitlin is the very first to formulate a specifically animal psychology, but that his attention to the animal soul during this transition moment in the history of science actually resulted in his status as paradoxically forgotten yet foundational. And finally, I consider how the experimental psychologist Wilhelm Wundt melded Scheitlin's insights with Darwin's methods to propose an experimental animal psychology of sorts, and to deny he was doing so all the while. Let us now turn to Darwin at the zoo. On March 28, 1838, Charles Darwin entered an orangutan's cage. The infant Jenny was the first ape he, as well as most of his English contemporaries, had ever seen. Outfitted in a dress and trained in proper spoon handling and tea drinking, Jenny was in fact the very first ape shown at London Zoological Gardens. Large enthusiastic crowds marked the occasion by visiting her in the Giraffe House, a wooden building her keepers specially heated so that she would not fall ill in the London cold. Rather than gather with the masses, Darwin, a gentleman who had donated many specimens from his Beagle voyage, was allowed to enter. He did not intend to simply gawk at the ways Jenny differed from himself, nor the ways she seemed similar to himself, and this was a disturbing experience for many, most famously Queen Victoria. Darwin wanted to encounter Jenny as an embodied individual, and a letter to his sister Susan 4 days after first observing Jenny, he singled out one particular series of interactions between orangutan and keeper. I saw the orangutan in great perfection, The keeper showed her an apple, but would not give it to her, whereupon she threw herself on her back, kicked and cried, precisely like a naughty child. She then looked very sulky, and after 2 or 3 fits of passion, the keeper said, "Jenny, if you will stop bawling and be a good girl, I will give you the apple." She certainly understood every word of this, and though, like a child, she had great work to stop whining, she at last succeeded, and then got the apple, with which she jumped into an armchair and began eating it with the most contented countenance imaginable. Darwin's early observations of Jenny's behavior suggest he was grappling with the following questions. Which methodological difficulties arise when one is trained to collect, prepare, and dissect animal bodies, but finds oneself exploring a radically different object of study, a living animal's expression, indeed, a living animal's expression of emotions? What is crying when studied across species? But most importantly for Darwin, if an infant orangutan cries, quote, like a human child, how might this physiological manifestation of a psychological state reveal fundamental similarities between orangutan and human? The difficulty Jenny posed to Darwin then was the inadequacy of existing frameworks brought to bear on animal behavior. In the late 1830s, the study of animal behavior floated between philosophers, naturalists, natural historians, and natural theologians in what historian Robert Young calls a common context, that is, a context neither determined by nor restricted to specialists. The prevailing belief impeding such a specialty was that thinking, feeling, and planning were not legitimate objects of inquiry, especially when that object of study was an animal. Faced with an orangutan making gestures and sounds he recognized as human-like expressions of emotional and mental states, Darwin, however, needed a new framework. In devising methods for studying animal behavior with the aim of researching mental evolutionism, Darwin performed what we would now think of as behavioral experiments on Jenny and other animals at the zoological gardens. When he showed her food without giving it to her, attempting to plague her, Jenny tried to strike him and showed teeth. He also placed a mirror in front of her and another ape and noted their reactions. They were perplexed, to say the least. The results of these behavioral experiments and others found their way into Darwin's 1872, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, which was translated that same year into German and was read attentively by none other than Wundt. As historian Richard W. Burkhardt Jr. has shown, Darwin did not intend to create an evolutionary science of animal behavior, but he nonetheless devised a set of concepts and methods which eventually informed the 20th century biological study of animal behavior. But before we get to Wundt's recognition that such behavioral experiments could ground a scientific animal psychology, let us first consider what an unscientific animal psychology would have been for Wundt. Let us consider Scheitlin's science of the animal soul. At the same time Darwin was plaguing Jenny, Peter Scheitlin was writing the most ambitious book of his career, based on his lifetime of observing animals. As Scheitlin wrote in the foreword, attempt at a complete science of the animal soul would be the first work to compile the history of animal psychology, that would be in volume 1, and the many capacities of the animal soul, that would be in volume 2. Rather than approach animals as animated machines made of discrete fleshy parts, Scheitlin's complete science of the animal soul oriented itself around a practice of observing various species, not taxonomizing and dissecting their corpses. The behavior of living animals, their utterances, reactions, movements, lay at the heart of this empathetic science, the most basic epistemological assumption of which was that expression indicated soul. Seele, German, soul, was the operative term here. Scheitlin contended that studying the expressions of the animal soul would crack open a series of questions posed for centuries. What is the animal versus the human soul? Does the animal have the same soul as the human, albeit a different kind or a different degree thereof? Or does the animal have a soul entirely its own? How is one to study an animal's soul in relation to its body when, for instance, the soul of a, I didn't translate that, the soul of a, I'll just leave that. But yes, very complicated. So what is a soul? For Scheitling, it depended on when and which language one posed the question. In primeval times, we can think of soul as a breath of life, pneuma, or in more recent times as a spirit gifted with consciousness. An I, a being with consciousness of itself, indeed of consciousness of its consciousness. To define a soul then entailed thinking about thinking, subjectivizing about subjectivizing, a tautological activity so self-indulgent that it produced, quote, a long string of entire disciplines and 10 strings of definitions, end quote. Scheitling found, however, that the numerous existing sciences of the soul had not yielded a satisfactory, exact definition of the soul. This is because soul was merely a word. And the common practice of muddling this word with spirit, mental capacity, sense, emotion, understanding, and cognitive power drained all of these words of their usability. To conceive of a science of the soul, one therefore had to be precise, teasing out what the soul encompasses but is ultimately not. One had to do this while also minding the work words do in mediating observation. Indeed, whether one used the Greek pneuma or the German Seele, the word colored what one perceived when attempting to express the relationship between an action and that which proceeds inwards or outwards. For Scheitling, too, animal was merely a concept. Scheitling believed that a particular language made available a set number of relations to the animal. As such, he recommended acquainting oneself with several languages animals in order to expand one's possibilities for relating to the animal one observed. Language, he argued, collapsed that mysterious manifold being and presumed a stable knowledge relation to it. The noun das Tier, which is German for animal, may be modified by the adjectives wild and tame, underlining how human-animal relations in this tradition had been predicated on domestication and even subordination. But what if das Tier, like the Latin animal from anima, designated, quote, a being with a breath of life without any degrading associations, end quote. And keeping with his attention to how conceptual constructs informed the real-life relations between humans and animals, Scheitling suggested that a science with the animal as its object of study especially can go no further than the limits imposed by its terminology. In other words, terminology contained the weed and the weeding. Scheitling charged any aspiring animal psychologist with weeding out the words in his language which prevented him from approaching with openness and curiosity that which we call the animal. Scheitling's science of the animal soul was paradoxically grounded in the slipperiness of terms demarcating the slippery boundaries between one type of life and another, transforming what was effectively critical linguistics into a science of the animal soul required a clearly articulated method which located it within the rapidly shifting scientific landscape of 1840. But Scheitling located his science of the animal soul in neither the natural historical cabinet nor the dissection theater. The aspiring animal psychologist was to observe living animals, yes, but sauntering off into the forest in the name of animal psychological research was not enough. In considering how to train an animal psychologist, Scheitling differentiated external methods from internal methods. The external methods included anecdotes and opinions, drawings and paintings by animal psychologists who depict the animal as a soul being, collections, museums, and cabinets where one may study anything from preserved butterflies to fossils, and living animals at zoological gardens, menageries, stalls, fields, forest, and one's home. It's important to note here that visiting zoological gardens and menageries often require travel, and Scheitling specifically recommended Paris, Vienna, Kassel, and Stuttgart. But to work with the same materials as natural history or the emerging field of zoology did not equate to working with their increasingly distinct methods. Even when studying natural historical collections, Scheitling designated his animal psychologist from the natural historian through the former's particular way of viewing the body. In regard to Cuvier's fossils, Scheitling wrote, "If we want to adopt these animals into our psychology, then we must begin thinking precisely about these animals' entire habitus, their posture, gesture, gaze, and soul capabilities." Cuvier had founded an entire discipline on piecing together bodies from remnants. Scheitling had a similar ambition. His complete science of the animal soul sought to piece together, quote, "if not the individual, then the general or species character of the soul," end quote. However much one learned from fossils, they paled in comparison to living animals. It was therefore the internal methods which could make or break Scheitling's science of the animal soul. "The internal methods are us," wrote Scheitling. By this, he meant the art of observation and talent for making inferences out of those observations. For Scheitling, observation did not simply entail collecting data through sight. It was a daily practice of learning to understand, apply, and interpret what one sees an animal do and what one sees oneself do at the same time. That is to say, a human in beholding an animal had to confront his own conceptual constructs before claiming to see that animal's soul as expressed through its behavior. Through a practice of daily, patient, and empathetic observation of an individual animal's soul, Scheitling's science of the animal soul sought to expand the human's limited perspective in deference to the animal before him. Despite being trapped within a natural historical model of collecting dead animals, Scheitling foresaw the establishment of stationary research groups which could track the movements of an animal's soul over time. But this was more fantasy than reality in 1840. Switzerland's first zoo, the Zoologischer Garten Basel, opened in 1874, missing Scheitling by 26 years and 153 kilometers. In Scheitling's Switzerland of 1840, the range of animals necessary for animal psychological research would have been centralized in natural history museums, the first of which was established in Bern in 1832. But again, those animals were dead. And so Scheitling advised the would-be animal psychologist to keep pets, as many as possible, thereby establishing his own zoological garden, aviary, and botanical garden for the insects. And we do know that Darwin did something similar at Down House. Scheitling was confident that the establishment of the institutional structures necessary for his nascent science would allow it to take off. He was so confident, in fact, that he envisioned natural history's reorientation as a science of the soul. He foresaw a glorious new era for the soul, and this time the animal would be included. This did not occur for reasons Scheitling anticipated. His science of the animal soul was simultaneously too antiquated and too advanced for its time. On the one hand, his desire to decenter the human from psychology allowed him to conceptualize a study of living animals based on expression as a worthwhile and even cutting-edge object of study. On the other hand, his great wager was that if one sought a mode of approaching the animal that did not have radical difference as its point of departure, then one needed to reach far back in intellectual history to much earlier modes of relating to animals. But in the German-speaking world of 1840, the soul as a key analytic was tainted. The timing here is crucial. 1840 was not too natural philosophical and not too natural scientific to prevent Scheitling's work from coming into being, but it was just natural scientific enough to prevent it from gaining traction, as the natural philosopher Scheitling praised faded into the background and a generation of natural scientists came into view. And so Scheitlin's science of the animal soul was caught in the sweeping pain transition from natural philosophy speculation, vitalism, and idealism to the experimental empirical natural sciences, which prized specialization. The rise of the experimental specialized natural sciences can be tracked in the publication organ of the General Swiss Society for the Collective Natural Sciences, of which Scheitlin was a member. From 1837 to 1906, this preeminent journal featured research by professors of zoology, comparative anatomy, botany, and geography. And there was only one exception that I could find, and it was in the first edition in 1837. And he was a famous explorer who actually became a diplomat. The publication's objects of study range from echinoderm fossils to plant monstrosities. But when the society did publish research on the animal soul in 1840, then it concerned not the living animal soul, but the anatomical heart and nervous system of a specific species. And it was written by an up-and-coming experimental researcher with a medical degree and a sharp scalpel. In Scheitlin's view, the natural sciences were becoming ever more invested in turning individual souls into categorizable bodies. For this, he blamed Descartes. Descartes marked the beginning of studying animal emotion, thought, and expression, but a most ill-fated beginning. Scheitlin accused Descartesian mechanism of initiating an experimental culture which treated animal expression as merely the product of animals' wooden organization and more specifically, drives. Even worse for Scheitlin was Descartes' method as it informed the notion of the animal. Scheitlin thought that Descartes' contact with animals was limited to dissecting their lifeless bodies. No wonder the great Descartes thought only humans possess spirit and soul. And with this, Scheitlin charged Descartes with effectively aborting the study of animal expression. Lacking speech and reason, animals were all material body responding to their environment, while humans, soulful and expressive, were the only candidates for psychological study. Scheitlin sought to counter Descartes' strong hold on the contemporary natural sciences through a deliberate and enthusiastic return to the soul. For Scheitlin, the soul still had work to do. But this did not turn out as he hoped. Scheitlin, who did not live to see a zoo in Switzerland, became best known for his animal observations. Despite going largely unrecognized due to what the general German biography called his theological, philosophical Enlightenment perspective, Scheitlin's science of the animal soul lived on. And it lived on, curiously enough, in repudiated form. Enter Wilhelm Wundt. In 1863, a 31-year-old Wilhelm Wundt published lectures on the human and animal soul. In his 29th lecture, Wundt complimented Scheitlin's complete science of the animal soul for its, quote, rich observations on the expression of intelligence in animals, end quote. But by 1892, when Wundt was preparing the second edition of these lectures, he made substantial edits to his lecture on animal psychology, even going so far as to include a new 23rd lecture on its many deficiencies as a science. Scheitlin's name did not appear this time. Let us now turn to Wundt's 1885 essay on animal psychology to see how Wundt became animal psychology's most prominent denouncer and most prominent proponent. 13 years after Darwin's Expression was published in English and German, Wilhelm Wundt, widely recognized by then as the founder of experimental psychology, he released an essay collection. Having established the Institute for Experimental Psychology at the University in Leipzig 6 years prior, he intended for essays to make accessible to a popular audience an expansive array of his life work up until that point. In the essay Animal Psychology, he did not waste time sharing where he thought animal psychology stood from his position in an experimental psychology laboratory near the end of the century. Quote, animal psychology has always been the stepchild of psychologists, end quote. His critiques of animal psychology's method were no less blunt. where Scheitling saw tradition and centuries worth of philosophers investigating the animal soul, Wundt saw an outdated psychology practiced by animal lovers and dilettantes who sullied real observation for the sake of the so-called animal soul. And where Scheitling found the concept of the animal serviceable, if not productive for indicating where the animal sciences had gone wrong and could go right, Wundt found a great and definite collective being. Wundt even went so far as to critique animal psychology of trying to collapse human and animal difference. Thus, long before Darwin, a trend emerged amongst animal psychologists, one which not only seeks to cancel out the difference between human and animal, but which could, every now and then, be called an inverted Darwinism, because it prefers to draw attention to such achievements which apparently surpass human achievements. Wundt's critique of animal psychology here contained within it a fittingly backwards compliment. Scheitling's animal psychology was a hyperbolic precursor to Darwin's evolutionism. Considering that Wundt had not even written 2 pages by the time he had effectively denounced animal psychology as a pseudoscience, the direction Wundt took for the rest of the essay is nothing less than staggering. Wundt proposed covertly, subversively, an experimental animal psychology, what he called a real animal psychology. And what would the rectifying model be? Darwin's early behavioral experiments at the London Zoological Gardens and daily recordings of his own children's behavior, both of which he eventually published in Expression. Under the guise of a fierce critique of animal psychology as it had been conceived up until that point, Wundt presented a systematic means of filling the holes he identified in animal psychology's methods in order to bring it into the experimental sciences. In Wundt's view, Scheitling was the most prominent figure in the old animal psychology, and Darwin's Expression, from which one could learn infinitely more real animal psychology, represented the way forward for the apparently misguided field. What an expressly experimental animal psychology needed then was a new founding father, and Wundt, in nominating Darwin for the role, ended up nominating himself. Or, in Wundt's estimation, one could not be the founding father without the other also being the founding father. Over the course of the essay, Wundt proposed a fusion of Darwin's evolutionary theory and his own experimental psychology and resituating animal psychology's critique of Cartesian mechanism. And without ever acknowledging it in the essay, Wundt essentially reframed Scheitling's critiques of the animal sciences through his own extensive knowledge of biology and experimental psychology. Like Scheitling, Wundt highlighted terminology as a hindrance to the researcher's impartiality, homing in on bad analogies like society and colony. In this regard, Wundt suggested that something uniquely complicated happens when humans use symbolic thinking to study animal behavior. The danger here, he warned, was that the symbol could come to take the place of the symbolized. This was scientific thinking's dead end. And yet, Wundt was deeply anxious. Taking as his object of study animal psychology could mean calling into question the empirical, positivist, law-driven experimental psychology upon which his reputation rested. If Wundt were to smuggle animal psychology into experimental psychology, he would do so only once he had passed off the animal to the most towering scientist of the century. But how obvious it was, wrote Wundt, to apply the idea of evolution to the psychic side of animal life. By 1885, Darwin's theory of evolution was, on the whole, accepted in the German-speaking world, having been popularized and defended by figures such as Ernst Haeckel and Wilhelm Boelsche. And the English naturalist Expression, although less well known than its predecessors on the origin of species and the descent of man, provided Wundt with a respectable frame, possibly even a plausible excuse for devising an experimental animal psychology. Whoever wants to study the mental development of an animal in particular will have to painstakingly keep a diary, as Darwin did in his biographical sketch of a child. The observer in zoological gardens who extends his investigations to many objects at the same time will certainly not proceed without this aid. Only then will it be possible to begin to carry out psychological experiments on animals according to a plan, and not just by chance as before. That is, to subject them to specific conditions in order to pursue their influence. This was Wundt's program for experimental animal psychology. The animals of zoos and aquaria would be the objects of experimentation, rather than those fundamentally transformed by domestication. Wundt also recommended studying the simplest signs of life in lower animals, but he especially recommended studying anthropomorphic apes to provide a better sense of what psychically separates human from animal. Studying an animal's psychological development would be the goal then, while studying the border between human and animal, between life and non-life, would be the ultimate goal. The model of observation was Darwin's daily recordings of his children's development in his M and N notebooks, which resulted in the 1877 A Biographical Sketch of an Infant. Wundt recognized here an ideal form of collecting psychological evidence which did not require the researcher to rely on memory. This practice could then be applied to Darwin's early experimental experiments on Ginny and other animals in the London Zoological Gardens, signaled by the Observer in Zoological Gardens. Only by making daily, painstaking observations of animals and something akin to their natural habitats could one begin the work of carrying out psychological experiments on animals according to a plan. In other words, Wundt advocated for controlling all possible variables and accounting for cause and effect, similar to Darwin showing Ginny food without giving it to her, cause, whereupon she bared her teeth and tried to hit him, effect. By way of concluding, I want to bring us back to the conceptual work and the rhetorical work of terminology. In his animal psychology essay, Wundt proposed an experimental means of studying the animal expression of emotions, and without using Darwin's term expression or emotion, and certainly without using Scheitlin's soul, which was outdated even in Scheitlin's day. What's more, Wundt distanced himself from his own proposal by using the future tense and the agents whoever and the observer. But Wundt's attempts to strike through the natural philosophical influences underlying his proposal were most strongly present in the near absence of the terms Scheitlin coined, animal psychology, and even more so, science of the animal soul. The condition of applying evolutionary theory and experimental practice to the questions Scheitlin posed about that which we call the animal was, for Wundt at least, the sacrifice of animal psychology. For him, what was at stake was nothing less than shoring up his experimental psychology's hold over psychological practice. And what better way to do this than through the history of psychology's most fraught object of study, the animal soul. Wundt therefore used the term animal psychology as a rhetorical mercenary, deploying it as either a pitiable point of contrast or as an insult, like eccentric animal psychologists. And yet, Wundt apparently took Scheitlin's science of the animal soul seriously enough to co-opt its questions and critiques and fold them into his own. He just did not call it animal psychology. He called it psychology. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that great presentation, Elizabeth. So if you have any questions, feel free to put it into the chat and I will ask your question. So one question that I wanted to ask is just in terms of just thinking about the soul of an animal and just animal psychology overall, you know, what is your perspective on that aspect, and you know, how do you see your research progressing on in this line?
So to reframe the question, are you asking me where my scholarship intervenes in current research on animal psychology?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So a lot of work has been done specifically in the Anglophone context, the most recent of which is Henry Cole's the scientific method, and he has a really great chapter on animal intelligence, and that just beautifully tells the history of animal psychology from within the English context. And so the work that has been done on animal psychology in the German-speaking world is really focused on new animal psychology. So that is from 1904 up until the Nazis. And that has been, there isn't as much work as you would think done on that. The focus is on Clever Hans. I'm sure everyone has heard of Clever Hans the horse in 1904, who caused a sensation when he was supposedly able to read, write, and answer trivia questions through an interspecies alphabetic system. And so the experimental psychologist swooped in and said, no, this is actually just him responding to unconscious cues. So that has been the focus so far in the history of German animal psychology. And I'm trying to actually create a genealogy that allows us to go back into the 19th century and think about what exactly made Clever Hans such a sensation, not only in Germany, but in so many other parts of Europe, and even in America. And so this is why I focus so much on Scheitling today, because it allows us to think about what animal psychology is doing for thinking about a science of animal behavior. What do we get? What is lost? What is gained when we think about the soul versus, say, expression of emotions? And then with Wundt totally getting rid of that, what does that provide for us? So that's what I'm trying to do in my talk today and in the chapter as it fits in with the project as a whole.
Great, thank you. I remember that Clever Hans story. It's a good one.
Absolutely.
I don't see any questions from our attendees. Oh, here we go. So we have a question from Lauren, and she's like, brilliant talk. Hi, Liz, brilliant talk. Just quick question, wondering whether George Romanes informs your research / interacted with William Wundt.
That's a great question because it proceeds out of Darwin. So Romanes was the one who really defended Darwin's work within the Anglophone context, specifically thinking about why we need to attend to animal behavior and why that could be a scientific enterprise. But he was ultimately rejected for the same reasons that Scheitling ultimately would, but in a kind of different context. So the use of anecdotes, especially, but within the German context, I have not yet seen Wundt responding directly to Romanes. He's bringing that back to Darwin, and within the particular constellation of texts that I mentioned. So the question of Romanes is totally legitimate here. I'm glad you asked that because there really are two trajectories that I think Romanes in the Anglophone world would be a really great parallel to Scheitling. And then we have Scheitling, as I said, within the German context, who's asking very similar questions, kind of pushing for this particular way of thinking about animals, but ultimately both kind of get gobbled up, kind of erased in ways that don't allow them to fit in with a sort of scientific model as it is conceived at that time. So it's a really interesting parallel. So thank you.
Any other questions? I'll give people a minute if they want to type something in. I don't see many more questions. So I think if there's anything else you want to say, Elizabeth, before we close out of the talk.
Well, I want to thank everyone for attending, first of all. I know this is for many the very busiest time of the year, and I really appreciate the Medical Heritage Library hosting today. But this, I will then contextualize this talk within my entire project, which is about the history of animality, language, and experimentation and how they collided in these really interesting ways that allow us to think about how difficult it is to study the animal and what that has looked like in these different time periods stretching from Scheitling all the way to Konrad Lorenz. So I've been thinking a lot about famous animals you have probably heard of, as I said, Clever Hans, but there is also a speaking dog who several experimental psychologists were fascinated by and found really, really difficult to study in the early 20th century. And then we get all the way up to Konrad Lorenz, who is writing popular works about communicating with animals, his relationships with animals. And so there are a lot of questions that I'm bringing up today about what does it look like to experiment with animals, on animals, thinking with animals, what that looks like. That I believe that begins with Scheitling and this kind of tension between the ways that he is, the way that he's conceiving of this particular way of studying animal behavior versus Darwin.
Great. A question just came in, and it sounds like you're answering it right now, but I'll ask it anyhow. It's fantastic talk. I would love to hear more about how the co-optation and reworking of questions and critiques from former intellectual traditions and other places from your work, where you found a similar pattern in intellectual history. So some of what you were just talking about may have responded to that, but feel free to add more.
Yes, thank you. So the German-speaking world, animal psychology of the German-speaking world, in which I'm including in my project Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. Those are the main places. So that has a very different intellectual history than that would be in the Anglophone world. And the stakes are similar, but they're different. So I am actually tracing Scheitling's intervention back to Herder and his thinking about animality and language, and how he is also thinking about the animal being educated, how do I put this? The human becomes human by way of education. And in order to do this, so Bildung in German, and in order to do this, in order for this to work, we need the Mittel, so this medium of language. And so I'm kind of using that as my starting point. It's very different from the Anglophone tradition, and tracing it all the way up to Clever Hans, for instance. That's a sort of an example I'm sure we all know, as I said, and thinking about why animal experiments so often focused on education and learning, and how that kind of took a different look in the German-speaking world, with these particular philosophical traditions undergirding them, in ways that are fascinating and also just really amazing, I think, when you consider today how relevant it still is to think about the difficulties of studying animals. So thank you.
All right, I think that's it. I don't see any more questions. Oh, I'm too fast. Two things. Do you find Scheitling, and I'm saying it wrong, worry about distinguishing emotion and behavioral expression thereof? That is speculation on anxiety about non-observable interior movements of the soul/psyche as distinct from performance expression. Also, any reflections on homology/analogy, that is common ancestor versus function?
Right, thank you. That's a great question, as have been all these questions. So the worry about distinguishing emotion and behavior of expression or behavioral expression is a really interesting question, which I think goes back to what we can actually know through studying animals, and what we can acknowledge that we cannot know. So Scheitling really builds his entire science of the animal soul around never being able to know what's going on in an animal's inner life. So he says that we can get an approximation when we look at behavior, when we look at, say, a fun example is a mouse who has 6 to 7 syllables, like kind of Pippin, squeak. And then from the 6 to 7 syllables, we can reduce or deduce that it has a memory for music. He actually sees in the mouse a sort of ability to perceive and to remember music. And so he's really interestingly linking expression, whether that is a vocal utterance or movements or the relationship with conspecifics, into what we would call mental capacities today. He believes of that as, he thinks of them as soul capabilities. So with Scheitling, the answer is he's not at all worried about thinking about whether non-observable behaviors, interior movements of the soul or psyche is distinct from performance. He's not worried about what that says about the viability and the sort of scientificity of his science. There's so much that we cannot see and we cannot know, and he accepts that. Whereas with Wundt, there absolutely is an anxiety. And I think that it's important to note here that this is a work of popular science. And he's actually addressing this popular interest in animal psychology at the end of the century. But it looks very different when he talks about it within the 1892 second edition of the lectures. That is for his colleagues. And he is quite anxious about how we can study animals. Doesn't think we can talk about behavior, or sorry, emotion, behavior. It's more about drives. And it's more about what we can measure and test. So thank you for that question.
You got from Melissa a great talk, and then you also have a follow-up from Legra. How does this co-optation work across linguistic lines? Is it easier to accomplish this intellectual refashioning / slippage when studying animals in / across human languages, German and English per se?
Thank you. So I'm going to reframe that question a bit and just thinking about what gets passed across lingual lines in terms of what is lost and gained, since it sounds like that's what you're asking. If we have Scheitling talking about the animal in German, is that the same animal in English? And I think that's what you're asking. And so what is really interesting, I think, with Scheitling, and what I would say allows him to be productively thought of as within animal studies, is that he's really pushing on das Tier, the word itself. And he really wants us to think about what we mean when we say das Tier and the associations that are kind of held up within that. So Wundt is not as interested in that in particular, but he has a critique, as I said, of the metaphors that we use in science, specifically in talking about animals in ways that actually are doing this work of collapsing human and animal difference. So it's really interesting to see that some of the same metaphors are being used in English and German, for instance. So colony, Stadt, so the community, so community. And then what's really kind of the most productive way of thinking about this for me is Scheitling's intervention here in saying, no, we think about things differently, and we need to, as responsible and curious observers of animal life, we need to take this into account when we see an animal in the wild, when we see an animal in our house, and also when we see an animal in a book. So I find that sort of critical linguistic intervention to be what animal study scholars are doing today, but framed differently, of course. We don't talk about the soul anymore.
And there's a thank you for the reframing of that question, and thank you for that. Any additional questions? I think I'll give it a couple of minutes because they came in suddenly the last time too, so I don't want to stop anyone who wants to ask some more questions. We have a couple minutes left. Okay. I think I am going to say there are no more questions. Thank you, Elizabeth, very much for your presentation. It was really great, and it's good to learn a lot of this new way of thinking about the soul of animals, honestly. thank you everyone for attending the speaker series. This is the last in the series, but I hope we will be presented another series at some time in the future. So please stay tuned and always check out the MHL, and we can will be great to see you all again in another event. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.